My name is Evelyn, and I am 38 years old, and I live in a quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Illinois, where the summers are thick with humidity, and the winters are sharp enough to cut through your heaviest coat. For the most part, I love my life because I have spent over a decade turning my small house into a sanctuary of peace and order. I work as a lead floral designer at a boutique shop downtown, so my world is usually filled with the scent of fresh lilies and the delicate colors of spring blooms. I have always been a person who appreciates beauty and structure, and my garden is my pride and joy. I spend my weekends weeding my flower beds and making sure my lawn is a perfect shade of emerald green. However, my peace was completely shattered by my neighbor Dave, who lives in the house directly to the left of mine. Dave is a man who seems to have a personal vendetta against the concept of cleanliness. He is about 50 years old with a permanent scowl and a habit of wearing a stained gray bathrobe well into the afternoon. Between our two houses sits a narrow strip of land that is mostly an empty lot. According to the property lines, a good 60% of that lot belongs to me, but because there is no fence, it looks like a shared space. To Dave, that empty lot was not a piece of land, but a personal landfill. It started out small with a few stray soda cans or a fast food wrapper that he would toss over the imaginary line while he was walking to his mailbox. I would see them glinting in the grass, and I would sigh and pick them up thinking that maybe the wind had just blown them over from his porch. I wanted to be a good neighbor, because in a place like Springfield you stay in your house for a long time, and making enemies is a bad idea. But the behavior did not stop, and instead it began to escalate in a way that felt almost intentional. One Monday morning, I walked out to get my newspaper, and I saw 3 bulging black plastic trash bags sitting right in the middle of my section of the lot. They were leaking a dark, oily fluid onto my grass, and the smell of rotting meat was already starting to rise in the morning heat. I felt a surge of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. I walked over to Dave's house and knocked on his front door as politely as I could manage. When he finally answered, he looked like he had just rolled out of a pile of laundry. I explained to him that his trash bags were on my property and asked if he could move them to the curb for the city pickup. Dave did not even look at me when he spoke. He just shrugged his shoulders and said that the town truck must have missed his house and the wind probably pushed the bags over. I pointed out that there was no wind strong enough to move 40-pound bags of garbage, but he just rolled his eyes and shut the door in my face. I ended up dragging those bags to the curb myself because I could not stand the smell, and I did not want the local stray cats tearing them open. That was my first mistake, because it taught Dave that I was willing to do his chores for him. Over the next few months, the situation went from annoying to absolutely disgusting. Dave started treating that lot like a staging area for his life's clutter. First, it was a stack of old tires that sat there for weeks collecting stagnant rainwater and becoming a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Then, it was a pile of rotted wood from a deck he claimed he was going to build but never did. The absolute breaking point for me was the morning I looked out my kitchen window and saw a broken ceramic toilet sitting right next to my prized hydrangea bushes. It was stained and chipped and looked like it had been sitting in a basement since the 1970s. I was absolutely livid. I marched over to his house again, and this time I did not bother with a polite tone. I told him that he had 24 hours to remove the toilet and the rest of his junk, or I would be calling the city. Dave did not even open the screen door this time. He just yelled through the mesh that I needed to mind my own business and that I should stop trespassing on his porch. He told me that since the lot was empty, it was public land and he could do whatever he wanted with it. I tried to explain the legal reality of property lines, but he just laughed a loud, raspy laugh and told me to get off his lawn before he called the police on me for harassment. I went back to my house and sat at my kitchen table with my heart pounding against my ribs. I felt so small and helpless. This man was literally dumping sewage containers on my land, and the law seemed to be on his side, because I did not have a fence or a way to prove he was the one doing it. I decided to try the official route first, so I called the Springfield non-emergency police line. A very bored-sounding officer told me that unless I had a video of him actually dumping the items or a formal land survey proving the exact inch of the property line, it was a civil matter, and they could not do anything. I felt like I was losing my mind. The next week, a massive storm rolled through Illinois, and the high winds ripped open several of Dave's trash bags that he had recently added to the pile. When I woke up the next morning, my entire backyard was covered in a layer of filth. There were old lottery tickets and greasy pizza boxes and used tissues tangled in my rose bushes. It took me 6 hours to clean it all up, and I cried the entire time. My hands were shaking as I stuffed his filth into my own trash cans. I felt like a servant in my own home. I realized then that being the bigger person was only making me a bigger target. Dave saw my kindness as weakness, and he was going to keep pushing until I snapped. I needed a plan that was more than just complaining, and I needed evidence that no one could argue with. I started Act 2 of my life by going to the local hardware store and buying a high-quality trail camera that was designed for hunting. It had night vision and motion sensors and was painted in a camouflage pattern that would make it easy to hide in the bushes. I also contacted a professional land surveyor. It cost me $250, which was a lot of money for a floral designer, but I viewed it as an investment in my sanity. The surveyor came out a few days later and spent hours with his equipment and little orange flags. He confirmed what I already knew, which was that Dave was dumping trash well over 10 feet onto my side of the line. I had the surveyor drive official metal stakes into the ground at the corners of my property, so there would be no more confusion about where my land ended and the wasteland began. When Dave saw the surveyor, he came out onto his porch and started screaming obscenities, telling us to get off his land. The surveyor was a big guy who did not take any nonsense, and he just pointed at his legal permits and kept working. Once the survey was done, I installed the trail camera in a thick cluster of cedar trees that gave it a perfect view of the lot and Dave's back door. For the next 3 months, I became a silent observer of Dave's middle-of-the-night activities. It turns out that Dave was even lazier than I thought. He would wait until 2 or 3 in the morning when the streetlights were the only things glowing, and then he would shuffle out in his bathrobe. I watched the footage on my laptop every morning while I drank my coffee. I saw him hurling black trash bags like he was trying to win a shot put competition. I saw him back his old rusted pickup truck up to the edge of the lot and tip the bed to let a pile of old drywall and shingles slide out onto my grass. I even caught him dragging an old yellowed mattress across the dirt and leaving it right on top of my property stakes. Each time he did it, I would save the clip and back it up to 3 different cloud drives. I started a physical folder too. I printed out high-resolution still frames of his face as he was dumping the trash. I noted the date and the time and the specific items he was leaving behind. I was building a case like a federal prosecutor, but while I was gathering evidence, things were getting much worse on the ground. The massive pile of trash was now attracting more than just flies. One evening, I was sitting on my back porch trying to enjoy the sunset when I saw movement near the trash pile. It was not just 1 or 2 raccoons, but an entire colony of rats. They were huge and bold, and they were scurrying back and forth between Dave's pile and the foundation of my house. A few days later, I heard a scratching sound inside my walls. My heart sank. The rats had found a way into my crawl space. I had to call an exterminator, which cost me another $400. The exterminator told me that as long as that mountain of trash was sitting there, the rats would keep coming back because it was a 5-star hotel for rodents. I felt like I was drowning in Dave's filth. I tried one last time to appeal to his humanity. I walked over with the exterminator's bill and showed it to him. I told him that his trash was causing a literal infestation in my home. Dave looked at the bill and then looked at me, and then he did something that made my blood turn to ice. He took the paper and crumpled it into a ball and threw it at my feet. He told me that if I had rats, it was because I was a dirty person and that his property was clean. He then told me that if I ever stepped on his porch again, he would make sure I regretted it. He was towering over me, and the smell of stale beer was heavy on his breath. I realized then that there was no reasoning with a man like this. He was not just a slob, he was a bully who enjoyed seeing me suffer. I went back inside, and for the first time in years, I felt unsafe in my own home. I looked at the folder of evidence I had been building, and I realized it was not enough to just show it to the police. I needed to hit him where it actually hurt, which was his wallet and his pride. I spent the next week researching every single municipal code in the city of Springfield. I looked up illegal dumping laws and public health hazards and hazardous waste disposal regulations. I discovered that Springfield has very strict rules about construction debris and old appliances because they can leak chemicals into the groundwater. I went through my video footage again, and I found the exact moment Dave had dumped several old cans of oil-based paint and a rusted-out car battery. That was the smoking gun I needed. I also took photos of the rats near my porch and the damage they had done to my insulation. I was ready for Act 3. On a Tuesday morning, I took my thick folder of evidence down to the Springfield Code Enforcement Office. I did not just ask to speak to someone. I waited until I could sit down with the head supervisor. I laid out the photos and the property survey and the log of every single time Dave had dumped trash over the last 90 days. I told her about the rats and the threats and the broken toilet that had been sitting there for months. The supervisor's eyes grew wider as she flipped through the pages. She told me that they had a file on Dave already because other neighbors had complained about his overgrown weeds in the past, but no one had ever provided this level of proof before. She looked at the photo of the toilet and actually let out a short laugh of disbelief before she turned serious. She told me that what he was doing was not just a nuisance, but a series of serious violations that carried heavy daily fines. She promised me that an officer would be out there by the end of the week. 2 days later, I was sitting in my living room when I saw a white city vehicle pull up to the curb, followed closely by a Springfield police cruiser. I watched through the blinds as 2 officers and a code enforcement agent walked onto the lot. They had my survey maps in their hands, and they began measuring the distance from the trash piles to the property stakes I had paid for. They spent over an hour taking their own photos and writing notes on a clipboard. Then they walked up to Dave's front door. Dave came out and I could hear him yelling all the way from my house. He was waving his arms and pointing at me, but the officers did not budge. One of the officers pointed at the pile of construction debris and the paint cans, and then he pointed at the property line. I could see Dave's face turning a bright shade of purple. The code enforcement officer started handing him yellow pieces of paper one after another. It looked like he was handing out flyers at a concert, but each one of those papers was a formal citation. Because I had documented the duration of the dumping, the city was able to fine him for every single day that the trash had been sitting there. They cited him for illegal disposal of hazardous waste because of the paint and batteries, and they cited him for creating a public health hazard due to the rodent infestation. They even cited him for the broken toilet because it was considered an abandoned appliance. When the officers finally left, Dave stood on his porch for a long time staring at the stack of tickets in his hand. Later that evening, I found out from a friend who works at the city hall that Dave had been hit with nearly $4,000 in initial fines. But that was not the end of it. The city gave him a 10-day deadline to have the entire lot cleared and professionally cleaned. If he did not do it, they would send a city crew to do it, and then place a tax lien on his house for the cost, which would likely be double what a private company would charge. For the next week, I watched as Dave had to do actual physical labor. He did not have the money to hire a crew right away, so he spent his mornings and afternoons dragging his own filth back onto his side of the line and loading it into a massive dumpster he had to rent. He looked miserable. Every time he picked up a piece of trash that he had previously thrown at me, I felt a sense of justice that was better than any bouquet of flowers I had ever designed. He tried to ignore me, but I made sure to spend a lot of time in my garden that week. I would hum to myself and prune my roses while he sweated and groaned under the weight of his own mess. He finally had to hire a junk removal service to take away the heavy items like the toilet and the mattress because he could not lift them into the dumpster himself. On the 10th day, the code enforcement officer came back for a follow-up inspection. The lot was finally empty and the grass was starting to show through the dirt again. The officer walked over to my porch and gave me a thumbs up. She told me that because of my thorough documentation, they were also going to bill Dave for the cost of my exterminator and the surveyor fees as part of a restitution order. I almost cried with relief. Dave lost a total of about $6,000 when all was said and done. He had to take out a high-interest loan just to pay the city so they would not take his house. Now the neighborhood is quiet again. Dave does not look at me, and he does not talk to me, and he certainly does not throw his trash on my lawn anymore. He actually keeps his own yard trimmed now because he knows I am watching and he knows I have the evidence. But there was one final twist that I did not see coming. About a month after the cleanup, I received a letter in the mail from a local real estate attorney. It turns out that because Dave was so far in debt from the fines and the loans, he had decided to sell the small portion of the empty lot that he actually owned just to make ends meet. He did not want to sell it to me, of course, but he put it on the market for a very low price just to get rid of it quickly. I had been saving up for a new greenhouse, and I realized I could use that money to buy the land instead. I went through a third-party buyer, so he would not know it was me until the papers were already signed. Now, I own the entire lot between our houses. I am currently in the process of putting up a beautiful wrought iron fence and planting a line of tall privacy hedges. Dave has to look at my beautiful expanding garden every single day, and he knows that I bought it with the money he lost because he could not be a decent neighbor. He is trapped in his house, and I have turned the graveyard of his trash into a literal paradise. Every time I see him scowling from his porch, I just smile and wave, and then I go back to watering my flowers on the land that used to be his landfill. It is the most beautiful view I have ever seen, and I earned every single inch of it. I have learned that while you should always start with kindness, you must also be prepared to defend your peace with the cold, hard truth and a very good camera. My home is a sanctuary once again, and the only thing Dave is dumping these days is his own regret. I feel like I have finally taken back my life and my dignity in this small corner of Springfield. The rats are gone, and the flowers are blooming, and the air smells like lavender and fresh earth instead of rotting garbage. It took a year of my life and a lot of stress, but the lesson Dave learned was worth every penny and every second of surveillance. He thought he could break me, but all he did was give me the opportunity to grow something even better. I still see him sometimes sitting in his bathrobe on his porch, but he never stays out for long when I am outside. He knows that I am not the quiet pushover he thought I was. I am the woman who owns the lot, and I am the woman who won the war. Springfield is a beautiful place to live when your neighbors respect the lines and your garden is allowed to thrive in the sun. I think I will plant some sunflowers next right along the fence line, where they can grow tall and bright, and remind Dave every single day that beauty will always win over filth in the end. It is funny how things work out, because if he had just been a nice person, we probably could have shared that space and had barbecues and been friends. But instead he chose to be a bully, and now he is staring at a fence that he helped pay for with his own bad behavior. I find a lot of peace in that thought as I sit on my porch and watch the fireflies come out at night over my new land. The world is a much better place when people are held accountable for their actions, and I am glad I was the one to make sure it happened in my neighborhood. I will never forget the look on his face when the police handed him those tickets, and I will never forget the feeling of power I felt when I realized I did not have to be a victim anymore. It is a good life, and it is a clean life, and I am going to keep it that way for as long as I live in this house. The story of the trash man and the florist is over, and the florist came out on top, just like I knew she would, if she just stayed patient and gathered her facts. It is a victory for everyone who has ever had a neighbor who thought the rules did not apply to them, and it is a victory for me and my garden. I hope Dave enjoys the view of my new greenhouse, because it is going to be the most beautiful thing on the block, and there is not a single thing he can do about it except sit there and watch it grow. My heart is full, and my yard is empty of junk, and that is all I ever wanted from the very beginning. Springfield is my home, and I have finally made it the sanctuary I always knew it could be, and I am never going to let anyone take that away from me again. I am 38 years old, and I have learned that the best revenge is not just living well, but living well on the land you took from your enemy through the power of the law and a little bit of common sense. I am Evelyn, and I am the master of my own property, and that is a feeling that no amount of trash could ever cover up. I can finally sleep at night without hearing the scratching of rats or the sound of bags hitting the grass, and that is the greatest gift of all. The war is over, and I have won.